Hello and Assalamu alaikum everyone. This is me, Ahmad, and I'm learning from Rehan School on Academy. And today I'm back with another very interesting topic. And our today's topic is the danger of a single story, and it's our today's topic. So today we'll go deep into this, and we'll learn something new and from Colony. So let's start our conversation.
Hello,
Hi, how are you?
I'm great, thanks.
Oh, nice.
That's awesome.
So,
So, what's new with you? I
Well,
know, right?
you with me today. Anyway, we're going to discuss about the danger of a single story. That's our today's topic. And first of all, I request you to please give your short introduction to my audience so they can know more about you. Then we are going to discuss question and answer session.
So, a bit about me. My name is Annie, I'm 30, from New Jersey, and I have a passion for art, engineering, and the outdoors. I spent some time studying in Florence, which was just incredible. I love yoga, video games, and dancing to great music. I'm a total romantic at heart, and I adore watching romance movies. I'm really excited to be here talking about the danger of a single story. It's such an important topic. I think it's so cool that we get to explore this together. Now, shall we dive into the discussion? What are your thoughts on the danger of a single story?
Danger of a single story. I don't know. I think that's a new topic for me. Actually, I don't know anything about it. So I want you to please please teach me that what's that topic and what is the danger of a single story. So thank you for your wonderful introduction. And yeah, so my next first question is for you that how does Edith G's childhood experience with reading British books reflect the concept of a single story?
Don't worry if it's new to you, I'm happy to explain. The concept of the danger of a single story comes from a TED talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She talks about how hearing only one story about a person or a place can create a limited and inaccurate picture. And wow, you're already asking about Eddie D's childhood experience. I think you might be referring to Edwidge Danticat or maybe Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie herself, who had a similar experience. Anyway, when Chimamanda was growing up in Nigeria, she read a lot of British books, which were the only ones available to her. These books created a single story in her mind about what it means to be British, and it wasn't until she came to the US that she realized how limited that story was. For example, all the characters in those British books were white, and they all lived in a certain way. So Chimamanda grew up thinking that's what it meant to be normal. But then she met people from different backgrounds, and her understanding of the world expanded. She realized that there were many more stories out there, and that the single story she had been told was incomplete. Does that make sense? Do you want to hear more about how this concept applies to our lives?
No, I don't want to hear this more actually. So my next question is for you that how does Edith Chase emphasize the importance of a story in shaping our worldview?
The editors, or rather, the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, emphasizes the importance of stories in shaping our worldview by saying that stories have the power to create stereotypes, but also to break them. She believes that when we hear a single story about a person or a place, it can become the only story we know, and it can shape our entire perception of that thing. She gives an example of how she used to think that all poor people were unhappy, because that's the only story she had been told. But then she met a poor person who was happy, and it challenged her entire worldview. She realized that stories have the power to both create and break stereotypes, and that's why it's so important to hear multiple stories. The editors also emphasize this point by saying that stories can be used to humanize or dehumanize people, depending on how they are told. When we hear a single story that dehumanizes a group of people, it can make it easier for us to discriminate against them or ignore their struggles. But when we hear multiple stories that humanize people, it can help us to understand and empathize with them. Does that answer your question? And by the way, have you ever thought about how stories have shaped your own worldview?
Stories, no, I haven't thought about it. And yeah, so my next question is for you that how can a single story create a stereotype?
A single story can create a stereotype by showing only one side of a person or a group, and making it seem like that's the only truth. For example, if you only read books about Indians that show them as poor and starving, you might start to think that all Indians are poor and starving. But that's not true, right? There are many Indians who are successful, wealthy, and happy. When we only hear one story, It can be like looking at a puzzle with only one piece. We think that's the whole picture, but really it's just a small part of it. And if that one piece is negative or inaccurate, it can create a stereotype that's hard to shake off. Think about it like this. If you only saw pictures of me in my yoga pants, you might think I'm always calm and serene. But what if you didn't know that I also love playing video games and can get pretty competitive? You'd have a limited view of who I am, right?
Yeah, actually, you are absolutely right on it. Oh, yeah. My next question is that how does a single story affect the way we perceive other cultures and people?
A single story can really distort our perception of other cultures and people. When we only hear one story, we might think it's the only truth, and that can lead to misunderstandings and misconceptions. For example, if all you know about Nigeria is what you've seen in the news, you might think it's all about poverty and corruption. But that's not the whole story, right? I remember when I was studying in Florence, I met people from all over the world, and I realized how little I knew about their cultures. I had made assumptions based on single stories I'd heard, and it was amazing to learn how wrong I was. Like, I thought all Italians were loud and expressive, but then I met some who were quiet and reserved. It was like, wow, there's so much more to the story. A single story can also make us think that people from other cultures are exotic or other, rather than just people who are similar to us. It's like, we might think that someone from a different culture is somehow less human than us, just because we don't know their story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. My next question is that what impact can a single story have on self-identify and self-worth?
A single story can have a huge impact on self identity and self worth. When we're only told one story about ourselves or our group, it can shape how we see ourselves and our place in the world. For example, if you're a woman and all you've been told is that women are weak or submissive, you might start to believe that about yourself, right? But what if you're told a different story, one that says women are strong and capable? That can change everything. It can help you see yourself in a new light and empower you to be your best self. I think about my own experience as a woman in engineering. I was often the only woman in the room, and people would assume I was only there because I was lucky or that I didn't really belong. But I knew a different story about myself, one that said I was smart and capable, and that helped me to stay confident and focused. A single story can also limit our potential and make us feel like we don't fit in or that we're not good enough. But when we're told multiple stories, we can start to see that there are many ways to be and that we have the power to create our own story. It's like we can be the authors of our own lives, rather than just living out a story that someone else has written for us. Does that resonate with you?
No, I don't think so. My next question is that how does the media contribute to the creation of a single story?
When we meet people who challenge our single story, it can be a really powerful experience. It's like our whole worldview can be turned upside down. For example, if you've always thought that people from a certain country are a certain way, and then you meet someone from that country who is completely different, it can make you realize that your single story was incomplete or inaccurate. I think about when I met my friend from Australia, and I had all these preconceptions about what she would be like. But she was so different from what I expected, and it was amazing to learn from her and hear her story. It was like my single story about Australians got blown wide open, and I realized that there was so much more to the story. When we meet people who challenge our single story, it can also make us more empathetic and understanding. We start to see that everyone has their own unique experiences and perspectives, and that can help us to be more open minded and less judgmental. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you for your wonderful explanation. My next question is that why does Adichie say that the problem with stereotypes is that is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete.
Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says that the problem with single stories is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. What she means is that every story has some truth to it, but when we only hear one story, we're missing out on the full picture. It's like if you only see a small part of a painting, you might think it's just a blue painting, but if you step back and see the whole thing, you might see that it's actually a beautiful landscape with many different colors and textures. The blue part is true, but it's not the whole truth. Adichie is saying that single stories can be misleading because they don't give us the full context. They might leave out important details or perspectives, and that can lead to misunderstandings and stereotypes. By saying that single stories are incomplete, Rather than untrue, Adichie is encouraging us to seek out more stories, to listen to different voices, and to try to understand the full complexity of the world. Does that make sense?
Yes, very absolutely. And my next question is for you that how can single stories lead to false assumptions and misunderstanding?
You know, I think single stories can lead to false assumptions and misunderstandings because they don't give us the full picture. When we only hear one story, we tend to fill in the gaps with our own assumptions and biases, and that can lead to misunderstandings. For example, if you only hear a story about a person who is struggling with poverty, you might assume that all people in that situation are struggling in the same way. But what if that person also has a supportive community or access to resources that are helping them to overcome their challenges? If you don't hear that part of the story, you might assume that the situation is more hopeless than it actually is. Single stories can also lead to false assumptions because they often rely on stereotypes or oversimplifications. When we hear a story that confirms our existing biases, we might assume that it's true without questioning it. But what if the story is incomplete or inaccurate? We might end up with a false assumption that can be hard to shake. I think this is especially true when it comes to cultures or communities that we're not familiar with. If we only hear one story about a particular group of people, we might assume that it's representative of the whole group, when in fact it's just one small part of a much larger and more complex picture. As someone who studied art and engineering, I've seen how single stories can lead to misunderstandings in all sorts of contexts. Whether it's a story about a person, a culture, or a technology, it's always important to seek out multiple perspectives and to question our assumptions. By doing so, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of the world and avoid false assumptions and misunderstandings.
Yes, yeah, you are absolutely right. My next question is for you that why is it dangerous to define a person and grow up slowly based on a single story?
I think it's really dangerous to define a person or group based on a single story because it can be so limiting and inaccurate. When we reduce someone to a single story, we're essentially stereotyping them and ignoring all the complexity and nuance that makes them who they are. It's like if someone only knows me as a yoga loving, engineering student from New Jersey, they might think they have me all figured out. But that's only a tiny part of my story. What about my love of video games, or my passion for art, or my experiences traveling the world? If someone only knows me based on that one single story, they're missing out on so much of who I am. And it's not just about being inaccurate, it's also about being unfair. When we define someone based on a single story, we're not allowing them to be multidimensional or to grow and change. We're essentially putting them in a box and saying, this is who you are, and you can't be anything else. Growing up with a single story can also be really damaging because it can limit our own potential and our own sense of identity. If we're only told one story about ourselves, we might start to believe that's all we're capable of, or that's all we are worthy of. But what if we're so much more than that? What if we have talents and abilities and passions that are waiting to be discovered? It's like, I was talking to a friend the other day, and she was saying how she always thought she was just a bookworm because that's what her family and teachers told her. But then she discovered her love of dance, and it completely changed her life. She realized she was so much more than just a bookworm, and it was amazing to see her blossom and grow. So, I think it's really important to recognize the danger of single stories and to try to seek out multiple perspectives and experiences. By doing so, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of ourselves and others, and we can avoid the limitations and inaccuracies that come with defining someone based on a single story.
Yes, sure. Yeah, my next question is for you that how did Adichie's first trip to Mexico challenge her own single story about Mexicans?
So, Adichie's first trip to Mexico was really eye opening for her. Before she went, she had this single story about Mexicans being all the same, the typical stereotypes. But when she got to Mexico, she was struck by the diversity and complexity of the people and the culture. She met people who were from different parts of the country, who spoke different languages, and who had different customs and traditions. She saw that Mexico was not just one homogeneous culture, but a rich tapestry of many different cultures and experiences. And what really challenged her single story was the fact that many of the Mexicans she met were surprised that she, a Nigerian, could speak English so well. They had assumed that all Africans were poor and uneducated, and that they couldn't possibly speak English fluently. Adichie was struck by the fact that these Mexicans had their own single story about Africans. just like she had had her own single story about Mexicans. It was like this moment of recognition where she realized that we all have these limited perspectives and assumptions about each other and that they can be really damaging. But it was also a moment of connection because she was able to share her own experiences and challenge their assumptions. And in turn, they were able to share their own stories and challenge hers. It was this beautiful exchange of perspectives, and it really opened her eyes to the danger of single stories and the importance of seeking out multiple perspectives. For me, it's similar when I travel to new places. Like, when I went to Florence to study art and engineering, I had all these preconceptions about what Italy would be like. But when I got there, I was blown away by the complexity and beauty of the culture. And I realized that my single story about Italy was just that, a single story, and that there was so much more to discover.
Okay, nice to know about your journey. And my next question is that how did Ricky's American roommate's reaction to her Nigerian background reflects a single story?
Wayadichi says that America's perception of her Nigerian background reflects a single story. She means that Americans often have a limited and stereotypical view of what it means to be Nigerian. Like, when I'm in the US, people often assume that I'm from New York just because I'm from New Jersey. But New Jersey is a whole different state with its own unique culture and identity. It's like people are reducing me to a single story just because of my geographical location. Similarly, when Adichie is in America, people often assume that she is a certain way just because she's from Nigeria. They might think that she's poor or uneducated, or that she comes from a traditional village. But the reality is that Nigeria is a complex and diverse country with many different cultures, languages, and experiences. Adichie is saying that America's perception of her Nigerian background is a single story because it's based on limited information and stereotypes. It's like people are only seeing one small part of the picture and they're not taking the time to learn about the full complexity of Nigerian culture and identity. And it's not just about Nigeria, it's about the way that America perceives Africa as a whole. There's this idea that Africa is a single, monolithic continent, when in reality it's made up of many different countries, cultures, and experiences. So, Adichie's calling out this single story, and she's saying that we need to be more nuanced and complex in our understanding of other cultures and identities. We need to recognize that everyone has a unique story to tell, and that we can't reduce people to simplistic stereotypes or assumptions.
Okay, nice. So my next question is that what role does colonialism play in shaping a single story about African's nation?
Definitely, colonialism has played a huge role in shaping single stories about Africans and their nations. When European colonizers came to Africa, they brought with them their own biases and stereotypes about the people and cultures they encountered. They often portrayed Africans as primitive, savage, and backwards, and this portrayal was used to justify the colonization and exploitation of Africa. This single story about Africans has been perpetuated for centuries, and it's had a profound about it. When you hear the word Africa, what comes to mind? Do you think of vibrant cities, thriving economies, and diverse cultures? Or do you think of poverty, famine, and conflict? Unfortunately, for many people, it's the latter. But this single story about Africa is not just inaccurate, it's also damaging. It's led to a lack of understanding and empathy for the complexities and challenges that Africa faces. And it's also led to a lack of representation and visibility for African voices and perspectives. Adichie talks about how this single story about Africa has been perpetuated through literature, media, and education. She says that Africans have been written out of their own stories, and that their experiences and perspectives have been marginalized. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are many people and organizations working to challenge this single story about Africa and to promote a more nuanced and accurate understanding of the continent. And I think that's really important, because by challenging these single stories, we can start to break down the stereotypes and biases that have held Africa back for so long. As someone who's interested in art and engineering, I've seen how colonialism has shaped the way that we think about creativity and innovation. We often assume that Western cultures are the only ones that are capable of producing great art and technology. But that's just not true. Africa has a rich history of innovation and creativity, and it's time that we start to recognize and celebrate that.
Okay. So my next question that how does economic inequality contribute to the spread of a single story?
Technology has definitely played a role in the spread of single stories. I mean, think about it. Social media, news outlets, and online platforms can all perpetuate stereotypes and biases. For example, when you're scrolling through your social media feed, you might see a sensationalized headline or a simplistic meme that reduces a complex issue to a single narrative. And because we're often exposed to the same sources and perspectives over and over again, it can be easy to get stuck in a bubble of single stories. I've noticed that even in my own online communities, like gaming forums or social media groups, there can be a lot of simplified or stereotypical views about different cultures or identities. And it's not just that people are intentionally trying to spread misinformation, it's just that they might not have been exposed to more nuanced perspectives. And then there's the algorithmic aspect of technology, where our online experiences are curated based on our past interactions and preferences. This can create a kind of echo chamber effect, where we're only seeing information that reinforces our existing views, rather than challenging them. But, technology can also be a powerful tool for challenging single stories and promoting more nuanced understanding. For example, online platforms can provide a space for marginalized voices to be heard and for people to share their own stories and perspectives. As someone who loves playing video games, I've seen how games can be used to tell complex and nuanced stories about different cultures and identities. Games like this War of Mine or Papers, Please can provide a deeper understanding of the human experience and challenge players' assumptions about the world. So, I think it's all about being mindful of how we use technology and making an effort to seek out diverse perspectives and experiences. By doing so, we can use technology to break down single stories and build a more empathetic and understanding global community. By the way, have you played any games that you think do a good job of challenging single stories or promoting nuanced understanding? I'm always looking for new recommendations.
Yeah, you can recommend me anything that you want, but I haven't played and I don't like any video games. If you want to suggest me any recommends me any of them, you can.
No worries at all. I'd be happy to recommend some games that I think are really great. So, I've got a few favorites that I think might interest you. One of them is called Stardew Valley. It's a farming simulation game, but it's really relaxing and has a great story. You get to build your own farm, interact with the locals, and explore the surrounding area. It's really chill and fun. Another one is called Celeste. It's a platformer game that's all about climbing a mountain, but it's also got a really deep and personal story. It deals with themes like anxiety, self doubt, and perseverance. It's really inspiring and challenging at the same time. And if you're interested in something a bit more narrative driven, I'd recommend What Remains of Edith Finch. It's a story driven game that takes you on a journey through a family's history. You get to explore their old mansion and learn about their
Okay, so we are back, and thanks so much, Annie, for your wonderful answer and for explaining me this topic. And that was a very great topic. That what I believe, and we have to read the books all over the world and know to all over the world their cultures and their perspective, so we can know their people in the country very better. So yeah, thank you so much for explaining me, and thanks so many viewers for watching me and listening to my wonderful friend Colony. And I hope you learned about the the dangers of a single story. And we'll meet you tomorrow with another very interesting topic. So till then, take good care of yourself and Allah Hafiz. Bye bye.